because he and the white kids would talk about, why am I a slave, or why are you not? Or he and the free African-American kids, well, how does this all work? In 1833, when he was 15 after Anthony died, Douglass was called back from Baltimore as they were settling Anthony's estates, in all his property, including enslaved people. And it was being divided among his heirs. And some of the property, the enslaved people, were going to be sold to the Deep South as part of the internal slave trade, sold to Alabama and Mississippi and Georgia as part of this large internal slave trade from Maryland and Virginia in the Upper South to the Deep South. This is another turn of good fortune for Douglass. He's not sent to the Deep South. He was continuously, though, rebellious to his enslaver, Thomas Old. Douglass was a teenager. He was smart. He had zero respect for Old as a slaveholder or as a person or as a man, and they continually butted heads. So Old hires him out to Edward Covey, who was a well-known slave breaker, who couldn't afford to keep very many of his own enslaved people, but who would hire enslaved people out and then break them for other slaveholders. Of his time at Covey's, Douglass writes, quote, I lived, and this is a long quote, so bear with me, but his words are so powerful, I don't want to paraphrase. I lived with Mr. Covey for 1 year. During the first 6 months of that year, scarce a week passed without his whipping me. I was seldom free from a sore back. My awkwardness was almost always his excuse for whipping me. We were worked fully up to the point of endurance. Long before day we were up, our horses fed, and by the first approach of day we were off to the field with our hoes and plowing teams. Mr. Covey gave us enough to eat, but scarce time to eat it. We were often less than 5 minutes taking our meals. We were often in the field from the first approach of day till its last lingering ray had left us, and at saving fodder time, midnight often caught us in the fields binding blades. If at any one time of my life more than another I was made to drink the bitterest dregs of slavery, that time was during the first 6 months of my stay with Mr. Covey. He was a field hand. It was the first time he had been a field hand. We were worked in all weathers. It was never too hot or too cold. It could never rain, blow, hail, or snow too hard for us to work in the field. Work, work, work was scarcely more the order of the day than of the night. The longest days were too short for him, and the shortest nights were too long for him. I was somewhat unmanageable when I first went there. Again, he's 15, 16 years old. But a few months of this discipline tamed me. Mr. Covey succeeded in breaking me. I was broken in body, soul, and spirit. My natural elasticity was crushed, my intellect languished, the disposition to read departed, the cheerful spark that lingered about my eye died, the dark night of slavery closed in upon me, and behold, a man transformed into a brute. The time at Covey's was instrumental in Douglass's life, and in his autobiographies, he spends more space on Covey's than any other kind of incident. And he was there a year. He does run away at one point and runs back to his enslaver and says, I'll be better, don't. And his enslaver sends him back. Old sends him back. So finally, one day when Covey was attempting to punish Douglass, who is now over 6 feet tall, 16 years old, strong, Douglass fought back. In his autobiographies, he says the wrestling match lasted 2 hours. We don't know how true that is. Anyone who's ever been in a fight, sometimes it feels like it lasts a lot longer than it actually does. However, they did fight. Douglass fought back, and he forced Covey to retreat. Covey was, I think, 28 years old, and Douglass fought him to at least a draw, if not more. He forced Covey to retreat, and Covey never dared to touch him again. Now, Douglass was taking his life in his hands. He could be executed for this, for raising his hand to a white man, especially an enslaver. But if Covey goes to the authorities, it's also going to ruin Covey's reputation as a slave breaker. So Covey doesn't do anything about it. He never dared touch Douglass again, and it was the first time that Douglass had fought back against a white man, and he consistently pointed to this fight as a central turning point in his life. It became his psychological and spiritual breakthrough. I considered him as getting entirely the worst end of the bargain, for he had drawn no blood from me, but I had from him. The whole 6 months afterwards that I spent with Mr. Covey, he never laid the weight of his finger upon me in anger. He would occasionally say he didn't want to get a hold of me again. No, I thought, you need not, for you will come off worse than you did before. This battle with Mr. Covey was a turning point in my career as a slave. And I think career is kind of an interesting term there, my career as a slave. It rekindled the few expiring embers of freedom and revived within me a sense of my own manhood. It recalled the departed self-confidence and inspired me again with a determination to be free. The gratification afforded by the triumph was a full compensation for whatever else might follow, even death itself. He only can understand the deep satisfaction which I experienced who has himself repelled by force the bloody arm of slavery. I felt as I never felt before. It was a glorious resurrection from the tomb of slavery to the heaven of freedom. The imagery there is just wonderful. My long crushed spirit rose, cowardice departed, bold defiance took its place, and I now resolved that, however long I might remain a slave in form, the day had passed forever when I could be a slave in fact. I did not hesitate to let it be known to me that the white man who expected to succeed in whipping me must also succeed in killing me. From this time, I was never again what I might be called fairly whipped, though I remained a slave 4 years afterwards. I had several fights, but I was never whipped. This is what he sees as his moment. And he does tie manhood, and we'll talk about that this summer, very much into this idea of fighting back. Not long after he left Covey's, he was hired out to a different enslaver, William Freeland, and there he organizes running away, organizes he and 3 other enslaved people to run away, enslaved guys to run away, and they get caught. Somebody kind of tells on them, and they get caught, and Douglass gets thrown in jail, and he, again, is at much risk of being sent south, but fortunately for him, his enslaver decides to just send him back to Baltimore. So he goes back to Baltimore, and this becomes another key turning point in his life. In Baltimore, he meets Anna Murray. All this has happened, he's 20 years old. Think about that, right? He's 20 years old. In Baltimore, he met Anna Murray, who was a free black woman. She was a little bit older than him. I think she's 24, 25. With her help, he escapes to New York. He dresses as a sailor. He gets free papers. She helps him get money, and he gets on a train, and then he gets on boats, and he ends up in New York, and then she joins him a week later, and they're married. And they change their names a couple of times, and then they become Douglass. And he and Anna remain married for 44 years until she passes away. She's the center of his home life. She's also primarily illiterate. And so he is so about literacy and books and reading, and she is not, but they have this partnership that works in some sense. As we'll get into this summer, he also has other women that he is close with. But he and Anna have this bond their entire lives, right? By 1842, he had spoken to abolitionist meetings, and at first the abolitionists want him to just get up, and then the white abolitionists will tell his story, and he insists on telling his own story. And when we talk about the biographies, the autobiographies, we'll talk a little bit about that. He's such a great speaker, and his stories are so compelling that eventually, and the crowds get so large to see him speak that eventually he's hired full-time. That's his job, is to be an abolitionist speaker. He also becomes a journalist, working for abolitionist newspapers, and then later starting his own newspaper. But in 1845, the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass is published. Again, he's 27 years old. And this is the first book that we'll read this summer, the discussions I'll be helping lead. After narrative comes out and he becomes a sensation, he's at risk. He's a runaway. He's at risk of getting arrested. So he flees to go to the UK to avoid being recaptured. And in the UK, some of his supporters raise money to buy his freedom. And he has a moral dilemma about this. This idea that his enslaver, Thomas Old, is going to get money for Douglass's freedom, that he has to buy his freedom. But finally his supporters convince him that it's the prudent thing to do. And he does get his manumission papers in 1846. He's officially a free man. He can't ever go south again, or he will, but much later, right? Abolitionists are not welcome in the South. but he can come back to the United States. In 1855, he publishes so he's 27 when he writes Narrative in the Life. In 1855, he publishes his second autobiography, My Bondage and My Freedom, where he revises part of the narrative in the first part. The first part of My Bondage is kind of a partial revision of the narrative, and then the second part is much more about his life in the North. It's an update, right? And so now I'd like us to shift gears just a little bit and talk about this idea of slave narratives as sources, right? So what are slave narratives? Right? Slave narratives are essentially their first-hand accounts of enslavement. We have approximately 6,000 slave narratives. Now, these are not all autobiographies like Douglass wrote. Slave narratives can be anything like brief testimonials found in judicial records, broadsides, newspapers, interviews, things like that. They also include published books like Douglass's. And they also include the 2,500 oral histories that were done in the 1930s and 40s by the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, where they interviewed formerly enslaved people. So all of these are under the umbrella of slave narratives, right? And that sounds like a lot, 6,000. But when you consider that at the end of the Civil War, there are 4 million people who were enslaved who are now free, and you think of the generations of people who were enslaved before that, it's a minuscule number. And considering that some of these are just a few lines, it's really a small number, right? Today, we'll mostly be focusing on, because we're talking about Douglass, the antebellum slave narratives, the slave narratives written before the Civil War, right? So there are also postbellum slave narratives that were written after the Civil War, where enslaved people were looking back, right? So when we think about slave narratives as sources, right? We think their kind of benefits are that they offer these first-hand accounts of enslavement, right? They personalize the experiences. We can have the numbers. In my classes, I do this. I have students, and we talk about the transatlantic slave trade, for instance, and we look at the literally 30,000 voyages of the transatlantic slave trade, right? The millions of people. And we try to get a sense of the scale and the numbers. But then when we read Uledi Equiano's description of the Middle Passage and what life was like on the slave ships, it brings it more into focus. It personalizes it, right? And that's what slave narratives can do, right? They give the enslaved a voice. The slave owners, the enslavers, were writing all kinds of stuff. We have all kinds of sources from enslavers. So these give the enslaved a voice. And they also offer details often not available in other sources, especially like the WPA interviews. The enslaved who are doing these interviews, they give these great kind of details, right? But there's also some kind of limitations of these as sources as well. One is that there's a small number of the total people who were enslaved, as I mentioned. The two, the antebellum narratives, like Douglass's first two books, right, Narrative in the Life and My Bondage and My Freedom, are primarily from men. We think about if runaway slaves are going to write an autobiography, the majority of runaways were men. The majority of runaways are young men, quite honestly. They have more opportunity to run away. They weren't as tied down with family responsibilities. It's hard to run away if you're pregnant, carrying a baby. Oftentimes, the men who did run away would have duties as slaves that would allow them off of slaveholders' lands. They had a little bit more freedom of movement, things like that, right? Women who were enslaved are way underrepresented in the narratives, in the antebellum narratives in particular. Also, people from the Upper South are overrepresented. People like Douglass, who was running from Maryland to Pennsylvania and then New York to gain freedom, right? We don't have as many slave narratives from someone in Deep South Alabama, a field hand in Deep South Alabama who was running away. So that's one of the limitations. They give us a better picture of slavery, but it's not a complete picture of slavery, right? Also, there are white editors for some of these, right? Some of the enslaved were literate and wrote themselves. Others told their stories to white editors, who then white amanuenses, who then wrote it out. That's why Douglass and others, narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave, written by himself, is part of the title. It's so important. Written by himself. He's saying, I'm telling my story, right? Harriet Jacobs does the same thing. She's telling her story, right? Although Lydia Child is her editor, and there's this, we don't know whose words everything is. There also are, in the WPA interviews, most of the interviewers are white. And in the WPA interviews, most of the interviewers are white, and they're interviewing people in the Jim Crow South. So in 1930s Mississippi, you have a white interviewer going to an elderly formerly enslaved person, saying, "Tell me about what life was like under slavery." Now, how honest do you think that elderly, formerly enslaved person living under Jim Crow is going to be to a white stranger who asked them to tell him what life was like under slavery, right? They may try to massage some things to not tell the hard truths, right? And also the WPA interviews are done decades after enslavement. So you have an 80-year-old talking about what life was like under slavery as a 6-year-old or 7-year-old or 8-year-old, and it's difficult, right? So these are just limitations. They're still great sources, and we use them as sources, but we think about these. So when we read Douglass's writings this summer, we'll be thinking about these. We also want to think, well, who wrote the document? With Douglass, he's saying, I wrote it. We know he wrote it, right? Other slave narratives, we have to think about that a bit more. When was it written? Slave narratives are written before the Civil War. The antebellum narratives, like Douglass's first 2 books, are attacks on slavery aimed at the abolitionist audience. Slave narratives that are written after the Civil War are oftentimes much more about kind of the personal journey of the person, and it's not about ending slavery. Oftentimes those are much more about a spiritual journey, and they're about a person coming to God in some sense. Who was the audience? We need to think about that. Harriet Jacobs, An Incidents of the Life of a Slave Girl, is very clearly aiming at middle-class white women in the North. And she talks about, I'm a mother just like you. She says, her enslaver is trying to sexually assault her, and she says, my respectability means as much to me as yours does to you, right? So we have to think about who the audience is as well. Was it dictated to an amanuensis, or was it written by the formerly enslaved person? And how does this affect the authenticity, right? We have to think about all of this stuff as we use these. Right? And that's kind of the fun part of being a historian, is not just taking these at face value, but digging in. And one of the questions in terms of authenticity is Douglass's memory was remarkable. And historians have gone back over the years, and he's remembering names decades later, and other historians have checked records, and he's right, and they've kind of cross-checked what he says in his narratives, and they're right. Like they're backed up by other documents, which is pretty remarkable. So there were approximately 100 slave narratives that were published as books or pamphlets between 1760 and 1865, before the Civil War, right, and during the Civil War, and approximately another 100 after the Civil War. Again, we think about the numbers. That's tiny. That's minuscule, right? The slave narrative reached the height of its influence and formal development during the antebellum period from 1836 up to 1861, leading up to the Civil War. And this is right in Douglass's wheelhouse. This is when narrative comes out. This is when My Bondage and My Freedom comes out. And Douglass is one who helps create this market, who helps create the slave narrative as a major tool in fighting slavery. Right? Also, the slave narratives provide a model for novelists like Harriet Beecher Stowe in Uncle Tom's Cabin, right? Probably the most famous early slave narrative is Ulidah Equiano, And his kind of establishes in many ways the format that others would follow, especially the written by himself. In the 19th century, Douglass is among the most well-known, along with William Wells Brown, who was enslaved here in St. Louis, by the way, and talks about St. Louis in his, Harriet Jacobs, and others, of course. Again, these reach from a few pages, kind of pamphlets, to large books, right? Independently published books. As the anti-slavery movement became more and more powerful in the kind of leading up to the Civil War, the demand for slave narratives grew. There were these audiences that wanted to read about what life was like under slavery. And Douglass figured out very well how his writings could reinforce his speeches that reinforced his journalism. So the people who had come to hear him speak would buy his books. The people who were reading his books would read his newspapers. The people who were, his newspapers would reprint his speeches. So he's trying to reach the audience in all these ways. I swear if Douglass was around today, he would be on Twitter, he would be on TikTok, he would, he absolutely would. Plus he loved having his picture taken. He'd be taking selfies all the time, right? But it was all a purpose to make this argument against slavery. The goal is to expose the inhumanity of the slave system in these antebellum narratives. That's the goal of many of these antebellum narratives. They're trying to prove the credibility of the personal account, right? That's what Douglass is trying to do. He's trying to prove the credibility. This is true what I'm telling you. This is how bad slavery is. Because we have to remember the enslavers at the time were making the argument that slavery was a positive good. Slavery had gone from being, in Thomas Jefferson's words, a necessary evil, to by the antebellum era, enslavers are arguing that slavery is a positive good, that slavery is a good thing. So Douglass and others are having to argue against the inhumanity of slavery, right? And so he has this tightrope he has to walk, where this is my personal story, he's saying, but it's also representative of slavery in general. Right? And so he's trying to do both. The other part is to give evidence of the humanity of the African-American narrator. And he's doing this to the white audiences in the North. Right? Kind of like I was saying Harriet Jacobs is doing. Douglass is doing this as well. Right? And I think one of the most important things, especially for Douglass, it's evidence of the intellectual acumen of the enslaved. Pro-slavery people, enslavers,